In the aftermath of the global cataclysm that was the Second World War, a remarkably cohesive and self-serving narrative emerged from the surviving members of the German General Staff. Writing their memoirs in the relative comfort of the post-war Western world, generals such as Heinz Guderian, Franz Halder, and Erich von Manstein constructed a powerful historiographical myth. They argued that the ultimate defeat of the German Reich in the East was not the result of a fundamental structural inferiority in resources, manpower, or industrial capacity, but rather the consequence of a single catastrophic strategic blunder committed by an irrational, hubristic dictator. According to this Moscow First hypothesis, if the German High Command had simply concentrated all available armoured and motorised divisions in the summer of 1942 for a direct second assault to capture the Soviet capital of Moscow, instead of dispersing their forces into the southern steppes and the Caucasus under Case Blue, the Soviet administrative and communication hub would have shattered, triggering a total systemic collapse of the Red Army and delivering an absolute Axis victory on the Eastern Front. This monocausal, Moscow-centric interpretation has persisted in popular historical imagination, seducing generations of readers with the illusion of an easy alternative path to victory. Yet, when subjected to the cold, unyielding light of macroeconomic, logistical, and operational reality, this post-war apologia completely disintegrates, revealing itself to be a profound strategic illusion. To evaluate the operational feasibility of a German offensive against Moscow in the summer of 1942, one must first dismantle the myth of Wehrmacht invulnerability and contrast the reality of the austere in May 1942 with its starting position in June 1941. When Operation Barbarossa was launched, the German army was a pristine, highly trained and fully equipped force of over 3 million men, operating with thousands of brand new armoured vehicles and supported by a logistical network that had not yet experienced the grinding attritional meat grinder of the Eastern Front. By the spring of 1942, that army no longer existed. The devastating Soviet winter counter-offensives of 1941 and 1942, combined with the catastrophic effects of sub-zero temperatures, had inflicted over 1 million casualties on the Ostheer, wiping out its pre-war infantry cadres, decimating its specialized winter transport, and destroying more than 80% of its original tank strength. Out of the 162 German divisions operating on the Eastern Front in May 1942, the Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, had to admit that only a tiny fraction, fewer than 40 divisions, were rated as fully combat ready for major offensive operations. The Wehrmacht simply lacked the manpower, the tanks and the heavy artillery to launch a front-wide offensive as it had done in 1941. Faced with this severe deficit, any German offensive in 1942 had to be localized to a single strategic direction. The German army was a bleeding giant, operating on borrowed time and rapidly depleting assets, and any strategic decision had to be made under the strict, unforgiving constraints of absolute material scarcity. If the German High Command had yielded to the demands of the Moscow First advocates and concentrated its remaining operational panzer divisions for a thrust towards the Soviet capital in 1942, they would have been launching their forces directly into the most heavily fortified, deeply echeloned defensive network in the history of modern warfare. Having narrowly saved their capital in December 1941, the Soviet Stavka had transformed the entire Moscow strategic direction into an impregnable continental fortress. For hundreds of kilometers in front of the city, Soviet engineers and mobilized civilian laborers had constructed multiple concentric defensive belts, consisting of millions of anti-tank mines, miles of concrete pillboxes, massive anti-tank ditches, and fortified urban redoubts. Furthermore, Soviet intelligence was operating under the firm conviction that the main German summer blow in 1942 would indeed be aimed at Moscow. Consequently, the Stavka had concentrated its largest and most powerful strategic reserves in this sector, deploying over 60% of the Red Army's total infantry and armoured divisions, alongside the bulk of its modern VVS fighter aviation, to defend the capital. To make matters worse, the logistical infrastructure of Army Group Center was in a state of advanced collapse. The entire sector was dependent on a single, highly vulnerable railway line running from Smolensk to Vyazma, which was constantly being severed by active Soviet partisan units and choked by a severe lack of functional locomotives. To accumulate the millions of tons of ammunition and fuel required for a multi-army offensive against Moscow would have required the complete suspension of all supplies to army groups north and south, leaving the entire German front exposed to immediate collapse. A renewed German offensive against Moscow in 1942 would not have been a rapid war of movement, but a grueling head-on frontal assault of attrition against a well-prepared, numerically superior, and heavily dug-in enemy, a localized meat grinder that would have shattered the Wehrmacht's remaining mobile divisions long before they ever reached the outer suburbs of the capital. The underlying assumption of the Moscow First thesis, that the capture of the capital would have resulted in the immediate surrender of the Soviet Union, rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Soviet state's highly resilient, decentralized administrative and industrial architecture. While Moscow was undoubtedly a crucial railway hub and the political capital of the USSR, the Soviet leadership was fully prepared for its potential loss. During the extreme crisis of October 1941, when German panzers were within sight of the Kremlin, the Soviet government had already executed a comprehensive, pre-planned evacuation of its central administrative organs, state planning agencies, and diplomatic corps to the city of Kuibyshev, located hundreds of kilometers to the east on the Volga River. Had Moscow fallen in 1942, Kuibyshev would have immediately assumed the official administrative duties of the state, ensuring the absolute continuity of the Soviet war effort. More critically, the center of gravity of the Soviet war economy had already been successfully relocated far beyond the reach of the German military. In one of the most astonishing industrial achievements in human history, the Soviet Union had dismantled over 1,500 major factories and evacuated millions of skilled workers to the Urals, Western Siberia, and Central Asia. By the spring of 1942, this relocated industrial base was not only fully operational, but was actively outproducing the entire German Reich in every key category of military hardware, particularly tank and aircraft production. The massive tank foundries of Chelyabinsk, popularly known as Tankergrad, and the steel mills of Magnitogorsk were churning out thousands of T-34 tanks and heavy artillery pieces, completely immune to German land or air power. The loss of Moscow, while a severe blow to regional transport and national prestige, would not have halted the relentless flow of modern weaponry from these eastern industrial giants, leaving the Red Army fully capable of waging a prolonged, high-intensity war of attrition. To understand the true strategic imperatives that dictated the German summer campaign of 1942, we must move beyond the operational maps of the generals and analyze the cold, unyielding arithmetic of oil. Modern mechanized warfare is entirely dependent on petroleum, oil, and lubricants, and in this vital category, the German Reich was operating at a permanent, catastrophic deficit. Severed from global oil markets by the British maritime blockade, Germany's entire war effort was sustained by a fragile, inadequate supply composed of Romania's Ploiești oil fields and domestic coal liquefaction synthetic fuel plants. This production was barely sufficient to meet the peacetime needs of the German economy, let alone the insatiable consumption of a multi-front global war. When the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it consumed its strategic oil reserves at an alarming rate, and By the spring of 1942, the German military was facing an existential fuel famine that threatened to ground the Luftwaffe and paralyze its panzer divisions within months. As the economic historian Adam Tooze demonstrates, the German fuel deficit was so severe that the Wehrmacht's operational choices were tightly and irreversibly constrained by oil. The only geographical location on the Eurasian continent that could solve this crisis was the Caucasus region, which produced over 90% of all Soviet petroleum. For Hitler and the German economic planners, the southern strike of Case Blue was not an optional detour, but a desperate, structurally mandated struggle for national survival. As Hitler explicitly warned his generals at Poltava in June 1942, "If I do not get the oil of Maikop and Grozny, then I must end this war." Capturing Moscow in 1942 would not have solved this crisis. Indeed, it would have exacerbated it, leaving German panzers stranded in a ruined capital, completely dry of fuel, while the Red Army utilized Caucasus petroleum to fuel the motorized reserves that would systematically encircle and destroy them. Had Hitler yielded to Guderian and Halder and ordered a second direct assault on Moscow in the summer of 1942, the result would have been an operational and strategic catastrophe far exceeding the historical disaster at Stalingrad. Bogged down in the dense concentric defensive belts and subjected to relentless flanking attacks by massive Soviet reserve armies, the Wehrmacht would have found its remaining high-quality mobile divisions ground to dust in a brutal war of attrition. Even if German infantry had managed to force their way into the streets of Moscow, they would have been sucked into a colossal urban black hole, defending a ruined city of concrete and stone while their logistics collapsed. Their flanks remained exposed over thousands of kilometers, and their engines ran completely out of Romania's dwindling fuel. The Moscow First hypothesis was not a missed opportunity for victory, but a classic post-war apologia designed to shift the blame of defeat from the professional officer corps to a dead dictator. The cold reality of 1942 was that Germany had already lost the war of resources. Case Blue was not an irrational blunder, but the only rational, desperate throw of the dice available to a dying empire, a final, futile attempt to shatter the unyielding laws of economics and logistics that ultimately decided the fate of the war on the Eastern Front.